Hello, I'm Harold Munro, Editor-in-Chief of the Vancouver Sun and Province, and joining me is our legislative reporter, Katie De Rosa in Victoria. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Harold. Nice to talk to you this morning.
Yes, you too. So, you were writing last week about this cyber attack that the government came out and said they believe was state-sponsored, or at least it could even be by a rogue state. Well, did it affect anything you do in the press gallery, or what's happening there?
Well, it's interesting because, you come up with this, the government comes out with this news. It sounds pretty shocking in terms of a state or state-sponsored cyber attack. But, the caveat that they keep repeating is that there's no evidence that any personal data was compromised. So again, of course, we know the government has millions of British Columbians' personal data, from SIN numbers to addresses and even some passwords if people sign into accounts to access services. So, again, the government keeps saying no evidence that anything was breached, but that raises the question, well, what were they after, right? What were the hackers going after? And, Minister Mike Farnworth, he had mentioned last week in a scrum that there were changes the government made in 2022 to its cybersecurity networks and he said if those security measures weren't done and undertaken in 2022, the government might not even have known that this attack had happened because it was that clandestine. Obviously, the technicalities of it haven't been shared about how they would have gone about. But I think what Farnworth said is they were trying to cover their tracks. But I suppose that raises the question, well, if they were trying to cover their tracks, did they cover the tracks as to the data that they access? So how do we know what data was accessed or not accessed? The head of the public service, Shannon Salter, she said the government actually, or the security experts, had to go through 40 terabytes of data to find out what was potentially accessed. So, and I think that is the explanation. That is why it took so long for this to be made public. This cyber attack actually came to light in April 10th, but it was almost a month later that it was actually made public. But Shannon Salter and Mike Farnworth both said that was because the government needed to basically patch up the security holes so that if they tell people there was a breach, but they haven't got the doors closed, so to speak, the security system totally fortified, that could actually tip off other hackers that there's a vulnerability. And I talked to a UBC cybersecurity expert named Dr. Eric Lee, and he sort of said, think of the government's networks as a house with many doors, and you're trying to lock all the doors, and if someone gets in through a back door, you have to secure that lock, I suppose, secure that back door, but people might be trying to get in other doors. So these cyber hackers are using AI, generative AI, to use different passwords and basically use these attacks at every second. The Premier's office mentioned a stat that they fend off 1.5 billion unauthorized access attempts on the system every day. So that is from different AI systems just trying to use different tactics, I suppose, to get into the system. And that is why they told, at the end of April, they told government employees to change their passwords, to strengthen them to 14 characters. So, they're trying to make sure that all the the defenses are locked down. But yeah, I think it really raises more questions about, well, who is behind this?
Yes. Well, and even agencies that you think would be the most secure, like you think about U.S. military agencies or other sensitive agencies, government agencies, come under attack frequently and successfully. So I think it's difficult for anybody. And we saw it with London Drugs recently, of course, in the private sector. So these things are happening all the time. I note in your story there was a reference to remote work, and I hadn't thought about that. But does that compromise the system at all?
I mean, I asked that to Minister Farnworth, and he said no. He said there's a protocol that employees have to follow, so they would have to sign in on a VPN that apparently is just as secure as if they were in the office. But what Eric Lee said from UBC he said maybe there's an employee who kind of joins their home Wi-Fi, by accident, or they or forget to log into the VPN. He said it's kind of hard to monitor employees when they're at home. So he thought it was a little added layer of potential, security risk. But again, it's I know obviously the federal government has its employees working from home part-time, so it's definitely a bit of a I'm sure it's added an extra challenge to make sure that that's an extra safety protocol.
Yeah, public and private sector. So many people now working hybrid or working from home. I'm sure that's a bit of a boon for these cyber terrorists. We don't know which state, or do we even know if the province knows which state sponsored hours?
Well, so we don't, the province would not say which state, but there seems to be some similarities to last month. There was a cybersecurity attack on Microsoft that was believed to be by Russia or Russian-backed cybersecurity actors, and they targeted Microsoft, but through Microsoft, they were able to get communications that Microsoft had with various federal US government agencies, because Microsoft would be talking to those various agencies. So through that, they were able to steal, passwords and login details. So the question was asked, is this related to that incident? And the government would not confirm that. So, they didn't say outright, well, we know who it is, but we're not telling you. They basically just said, that's still under investigation. So really unclear to what extent they know who exactly was behind this. But again, I really think it raises the question of, well, what was the motivation? If no personal information was accessed, what was the gain here? What was the goal?
Yeah, it would help to know that, to see were they coming after, like you say, passwords or something that maybe could get them people's identities in terms of identity theft and financial crime, or were they coming after our infrastructure and going after our hydro dams and power grid or something else? Like we don't know. You're right for what that was. Have they said they're going to tell us, or is there some reason why they won't tell us?
Like, I think that what they're saying is it's still under investigation, but I mean, that's a great question. Are we going to find out eventually? I would hope so. I think that this is in the public interest, and to be able to have lessons learned in the future. So yeah, I think there's honestly the press conference on Friday, there was a tech briefing, and it was aimed at providing us more information compared to the information released Thursday. But I really think it left people with more questions. So we'll definitely have to follow up on how this investigation unfolds.
Okay. Well, speaking of questions, the opposition have one more week of question period. I guess 4 more days in the legislative session. Ends this week, and then everybody disperses for the rest of the spring and the summer, I guess, going back and doing their constituency work and ministry work or whatever they have to do. So what are you expecting in this final week? And maybe walk us through what's going to happen.
Yeah, so it's the final week of the legislature before the election. So I think that is going to set the tone for some very spicy exchanges in question period. The BC United this is their last shot to really, and of course the BC Greens and the BC Conservatives, all the opposition parties, this is their last chance to make an impression and to state their position on various policies. We know, for example, on decrim, BC United have been very firm on pressing the government to roll back some of the decrim measures. And we saw in the last 2 weeks, the BC government asked the feds to amend the decriminalization policy so that police now have the power to move people along if they're using drugs in a place where it's perhaps a concern, in a playground, in a beach. So that was definitely the BC United is calling that a win, that they were exposing the cracks in the decriminalization policy, saying that there's not enough treatment, there's not enough harm reduction services to complement the decriminalization experiment. Eleanor Sturko called it a one-legged stool, basically saying all the other legs are missing. So that definitely BC United was strong on that. And I know the BC Conservatives as well have been calling for an end to the carbon tax, for example, saying that it's costing people too much money. We can't afford it, and the government needs to find another way to, to offset carbon emissions. The BC Greens as well have been calling for better renter protections for tenants. They've been calling for vacancy controls, which means that rents can't be raised. If one tenant moves out, the rent controls that are in place have to stay in place. So you can't just jack up the rent when a tenant moves out. But again, the government has not had any indication that's going to go with that. But so all of the parties have been basically trying to articulate their policies, and they will be doing that for the next week as well before session ends on Thursday. The government has a few more pieces of legislation, such as the legislation relating to the HIDA agreement that it has to pass. Again, most of those bills will likely pass through closure, which means the government's going to force them through. That's obviously something that the opposition doesn't like because it limits debate. But yeah, so I
But
really
every government does it, right? The Liberals did it. They all do it. Yeah.
every opposition complains about it, but when they're in power,
Yes,
they
do it.
do it. So it'll be interesting to see how often the premier is in question period. He doesn't always attend question period, but then it's also very interesting that he has been increasingly answering the BC Conservatives questions in question period. The premier often gets asked questions in question period, but another minister will respond.
Right.
But we are seeing quite a bit that the premier will respond to the BC Conservatives questions. And last week during the ICBC press conference, the premier mentioned John Rustad 7 times and only mentioned Kevin Falcon 3 times. So I think that's a little bit indicator as to who he thinks his main opponent is in the upcoming election.
Interesting. Well, speaking of that, you say they'll be gone after this week. The government, of course, can still go out and make lots of announcements, as I'm sure they will, pre-election announcements around capital and spending and other things. The opposition parties have a little more difficult of a time, I guess, getting media attention, but they'll be presumably bringing some things forward. And then I guess there's probably still a bunch of nomination meetings for all the parties for candidates for this fall.
Yeah, well, actually, last week we heard that Finance Minister Katrina Conroy, she announced she's not going to be running again.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a big, a long time veteran MLA that will have to be replaced. So it will definitely be interesting to see how the parties fill their nominations. And of course, the attacks are going on, trying to find, opposition research, as they call it, on different candidates. But so as you said, there will not be a fall session before the election on October 19th. So again, this week is the last time to see the question period exchanges, and then all the barbs will be traded basically in the media, really, or with their ads. I know BC United has been really pushing its ads. They've been running it during the Canucks games, trying to get Kevin Falcon, out there, get his name known. He's been doing a lot of town hall meetings, and he told me that the town hall meetings is where he's confident that BC United is actually doing well. He doesn't believe the polls. He thinks that people are conflating the BC Conservatives with the federal Conservatives, but he said as people get to know John Rustad, they will see it's not the same party, and he's confident that he's resonating with voters because of who's showing up to the town halls. So, the polls will become more relevant as we approach the election, but certainly right now the polls haven't been great for BC United.
No, well, town halls, politicians love to talk about town halls, but it's only a few hundred people at best. And a lot of them are just people who are their core support. So I'm not sure how that's reflective of the broader voting populace, but I guess we'll see as we get through the summer. Well, I hope you have a little bit of a break over the summer, and you'll be going full tilt come the fall. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Harold. Nice to talk to you.